This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 5, Chapters 12 through 18.
Part 5, Chapter 12. The quickest way to the cathedral is down a turning on the right-hand side of the Street of the Three Pebbles. Charlie's bar was on the left-hand side of the street, always crowded after 6 o'clock by officers of every regiment, drinking eggnogs, martinis, sherry cobblers, and other liquids, which helped men marvelously to forget the beastliness of war, and gave them the gift of laughter, and made them careless of the battles which would have to be fought. Young staff officers were there, explaining carefully how hard-worked they were, and how often they went under shell fire. The fighting officers, English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh, jeered at them, laughed hugely at the latest story of mirthful horror, arranged rendezvous, the Godeb restaurant, where they would see the beautiful Marguerite until she transferred to La Cathedral in the same street, and our cheques which Charlie cashed at a discount, with a noble faith in British honesty, not often, as he told me, being hurt by a steamer. Charlie's bar was wrecked by shell fire afterward, and he went to Abbeville and set up a more important establishment, which was wrecked, too, in a fierce air raid, before the paint was dry on the walls. The cathedral was a shrine to which many men and women went all through the war, called into its white halls by the spirit of beauty which dwelt there, and by its silence and peace. The great west door was screened from bomb splinters by sandbags piled high, and inside there were other walls of sandbags closing in the sanctuary and some of the windows. But these signs of war did not spoil the majesty of the tall columns and high roof, nor the loveliness of the sculptured flowers below the clerestory arches, nor the spiritual mystery of those great, dim aisles, where light flickered and shadows lurked, and the ghosts of history came out of their tombs to pace these stones again where 5, 6, 7 centuries before they had walked to worship God, in joy or in despair, or to show their beauty of young womanhood, peasant girl or princess to lovers gazing by the pillars, or to plight their troth as royal brides, or get a crown for their heads, or mercy for their dead bodies in velvet-draped coffins. Our soldiers went in there, as many centuries before other English soldiers, who came out with Edward the Black Prince, by way of Crecy, or with Harry the King, through Agincourt. 500 years hence, if Amiens Cathedral still stands, undamaged by some new and monstrous conflict, in a world of incurable folly, the generation of that time will think now and then, perhaps, of the English lads in khaki, who tramped up the highway of this nave with their field caps under their arms, each footstep leaving the imprint of a wet boot on the old flagstones, awed by the silence and the spaciousness, with a sudden heartache for a closer knowledge, or some knowledge, of the God worshipped there, the God of love, while, not far away, men were killing one another by high explosives, shells, hand grenades, mines, machine guns, bayonets, poison gas, trench mortars, tanks, and, in close fighting, with short daggers like butcher's knives or clubs with steel knobs. I watched the faces of the men who entered here. Some of them, like the Australians and New Zealanders, unfamiliar with cathedrals and not religious by instinct or training, wandered round in a wondering way, with a touch of scorn, even of hostility, now and then, for these mysteries, the chanting of the office, the tinkling of the bells at the high mass, which were beyond their understanding, and which they could not link up with any logic of life, as they knew it now, away up by Bapaume or Bullecourt, where God had nothing to do, seemingly, with a night raid into Boche lines, when they blew a party of Germans to bits by dropping stoke bombs down their dugout, or with the shrieks of German boys, mad with fear, when the Australians jumped on them in the darkness and made haste with their killing. All the same, this great church was wonderful, and the Australians, scrunching their slouch hats, stared up at the tall columns to the clerestory arches, and peered through the screen to the golden sun upon the high altar, and touched old tombs with their muddy hands, reading the dates on them, 1250, 1155, 1415, with astonishment at their antiquity. Their clean-cut hatchet faces, sun-baked, tanned by rain and wind, their simple blue-grey eyes, the fine, strong grace of their bodies, as they stood at ease in this place of history, struck me as being wonderfully like all that one imagines of those English knights and squires Norman English who rode through France with the Black Prince. It is as though Australia had bred back to the old strain. Our own English soldiers were less arresting to the eye, more dapper and neat, not such evident children of nature. Gravely they walked up the aisles, standing in groups where a service was in progress, watching the movements of the priests, listening to the choir and organ with reverent, dreamy eyes. Some of them country lads thought back, I fancy, to some village church in England where they had sung hymns with mother and sisters in the days before the war. England and that little church were a long way off now, perhaps all eternity away. I saw one boy standing quite motionless with wet eyes, without self-consciousness. This music, this place of thoughtfulness, had made something break in his heart. Some of our young officers, but not many, knelt on the cane chairs and prayed, face in hands. French officers crossed themselves and their medals tinkled as they walked up the aisles. Always there were women in black weeds kneeling before the side altars, praying to the Virgin for husbands and sons, dead or alive, lighting candles below holy pictures and statues. Our men tiptoed past them, holding steel hats or field caps, and putting their packs against the pillars. On the steps of the cathedral I heard two officers talking one day. How can one reconcile all this with the war? Why not? I suppose we're fighting for justice and all that. That's what the Daily Mail tells us. Seriously, old man, where does Christ come in? He wasn't against righteous force. He chased the money changers out of the temple. Yes, but his whole teaching was love and forgiveness. Thou shalt not kill. Little children, love one another. Turn the other cheek. Is it all sheer tosh? If so, why go on pretending? Take chaplains in khaki, these lieutenant colonels with black crosses. They make me sick. It's either one thing or the other. Brute force or Christianity. I am harking back to the brute force theory. But I'm not going to say God is love one day and then prod a man in the stomach the next. Let's be consistent. The other fellows asked for it. They attacked first. Yes, but we are all involved. Our diplomacy, our secret treaties, our philosophical dope over the masses, our imperial egotism, our trade rivalries, all that was a direct challenge of might against right. The Germans are more efficient and more logical, that's all. They prepared for the inevitable and struck first. We knew the inevitable was coming but didn't prepare. Being too damned inefficient, I have a leaning toward religion. Instinctively I'm for Christ. But it doesn't work in with efficiency and machine guns. It belongs to another department, that's all. We're spiritual and animal at the same time. In one part of my brain I'm a gentleman. In another a beast. It's conflict. We can't eliminate the beast, but we can control it now, and then when it gets too obstreperous. And that's where religion helps. It's the high ideal otherworldliness. The Germans pray to the same God, praise Christ and ask for victory. Let them. It may do them a bit of good. It seems to me God is above all the squabbles of humanity, doesn't care a damn about them. But the human soul can get into touch with the infinite and the ideal, even while he is doing butcher's work and beastliness. That doesn't matter very much. It's part of the routine of life. But it does matter. It makes agony and damnation in the world. It creates cruelty and tyranny and all bloody things. Surely if we believe in God anyhow in Christian ethics, this war is a monstrous crime in which all humanity is involved. The Hun started it. Let's go and give the glad eye to Marguerite. At night, in moonlight, Amiens Cathedral was touched with a new spirituality, a white magic beyond all words of beauty. On many nights of war one walked round the cathedral square, looking up at that grand mass of masonry, with all its pinnacles and buttresses gleaming like silver, and its sculptured tracery like lacework, and a flood of milky light glamorous on walls in which every stone was clear cut beyond a vast shadow world. How old it was! How many human eyes through many centuries had come in the white light of the moon to look at this dream in Stonehenge shrining the faith of men. The revolution had surged round these walls, and the screams of wild women, and their shrill laughter, and their cries for the blood of aristocrats had risen from this square. Pageants of kingship and royal death had passed across these pavements through the great doors there. Peasant women, in the darkness, had wept against these walls, praying for God's pity for their hearts. Now the English officers were lighting cigarettes in the shelter of a wall, the outline of their features' knightly faces touched by the moonlight. There were flashes of gun fire in the sky beyond the river. A good night for a German air raid, said one of the officers. Yes, a lovely night for killing women in their sleep, said the other man. The people of Amiens were sleeping, and no light gleamed through their shutters. Part 5, Chapter 13. Coming away from the cathedral through a side street going into the Rue des Trois Caloques, I used to pass the Palais de Justice, a big, grim building with a long flight of steps leading up to its doorways, and above the portico the figure of Justice, blind, holding her scales. There was no justice there during the war, but rooms full of French soldiers with smashed faces, blind, many of them, like that woman in stone. They used to sit, on fine days, on the flight of steps, a tragic exhibition of war for passers-by to see. Many of them revealed no faces, but were white masks of cotton wool bandaged round their heads. Others showed only the upper parts of their faces, and the places where their jaws had been were tied up with white rags. There were men without noses and men with half their scalps torn away. French children used to stare through the railings at them, gravely with childish curiosity, without pity. English soldiers gave them a passing glance, and went on to places where they might be made like this, without faces or jaws or noses or eyes. By their uniforms I saw that there were chasseurs alpins and chasseurs d'Afrique and young infantrymen of the line and gunners. They sat, without restlessness, watching the passers-by if they had eyes to see, or if blind, feeling the breeze about them and listening to the sound of passing feet. Part 5, Chapter 14. The prettiest view of Amiens was from the banks of the Somme outside the city, on the east side, and there was a charming walk along the towpath, past market gardens going down to the river on the opposite bank, and past the gardens of little chalets built for love in idleness in days of peace. They were of fantastic architecture, these cottages, where well-to-do citizens of Amiens used to come for week-ends of boating and fishing, and their garden gates at the end of wooden bridges over backwaters were of iron twisted into the shapes of swans or flowers. And there were snails of terracotta on the chimney pots, and painted woodwork on the walls, in the worst taste, yet amusing and pleasing to the eye in their green bowers. I remember one called Mon Idi, and wondered that any man should be proud of such a freakish conception of a country house. They were abandoned during the war, except one or two used for casual rendezvous between French officers and their lighto loves, and the towpath was used only by stray couples who came out for loneliness, and British soldiers walking out with French girls. The market gardeners punted down the river in long, shallow boats like gondolas, laden high with cabbages, cauliflowers, and asparagus, and farther upstream there was a boathouse where orderlies from the New Zealand hospital in Amiens used to get skiffs for an hour's rowing, leaning on their oars to look at the picture of the cathedral rising like a mirage beyond the willows and the encircling water, with fleecy clouds above its glittering roof, or lurid storm clouds with the red glow of sunset beneath their wings. In the dusk or the darkness there was silence along the banks, but for a ceaseless throbbing of distant gun fire, rising sometimes to a fury of drumming when the French Soixante-Quinze was at work, outside Roye and the lines beyond Suzanne. It was what the French call le rafale des tambours de la mort, the ruffle of the drums of death. The winding waters of the Somme flowed in higher reaches through the hell of war by Biarches and St. Christ. This side of Peronne, where dead bodies floated in slime and blood, and there was a litter of broken bridges and barges and ammunition boxes. The river itself was a highway into hell, and there came back upon its tide in slow-moving barges the wreckage of human life, fresh from the torturers. These barges used to unload their cargoes of maimed men at a carpenter's yard just below the bridge, outside the city, and often as I passed I saw human bodies being lifted out and carried on stretchers into the wooden sheds. They were the bad cases, French boys wounded in the abdomen or lungs, or with their limbs torn off or hopelessly shattered. It was an agony for them to be moved, even on the stretchers. Some of them cried out in fearful anguish or moaned like wounded animals, again and again. Those sounds spoiled the music of the lapping water and the whispering of the willows and the song of birds. The sight of these tortured boys, made useless in life, took the color out of the flowers and the beauty out of that vision of the great cathedral, splendid above the river. Women watched them from the bridge, straining their eyes as the bodies were carried to the bank. I think some of them looked for their own men. One of them spoke to me one day. "That is what the Germans do to our sons. Bandits, assassins." "Yes, that is war, madame." She put a skinny hand on my arm. "Will it go on forever, this war? Until all the men are killed?" "Not so long as that, madame. Some men will be left alive. The very old and the very young, and the lucky ones, and those behind the lines." "The Germans are losing many men, monsieur?" "Heaps, madame. I have seen their bodies strewn about the fields." "Ah, that is good. I hope all German women will lose their sons, as I have lost mine." "Where was that, madame?" "Over there." "Over there." She pointed up the Somme. He was a good son, a fine boy. It seems only yesterday he lay at my breast. My man weeps for him. They were good comrades. It is sad, madame. Ah, but yes, it is sad. Au revoir, monsieur. Au revoir, madame. Part 5, Chapter 15. There was a big hospital in Amiens, close to the railway station, organized by New Zealand doctors and nurses. I went there one day in the autumn of 1914, when the army of von Kluck had passed through the city and gone beyond. The German doctors had left behind the instruments abandoned by an English unit sharing the retreat. The French doctor who took me round told me the enemy had behaved well in Amiens. At least he had refrained from atrocities. As I went through the long wards, I did not guess that one day I should be a patient there. That was 2 years later, at the end of the Somme battles. I was worn out and bloodless after 5 months of hard strain and nervous wear and tear. Some bug had bitten me up in the fields where lay the unburied dead. Trench fever, said the doctor. You look in need of a rest, said the matron. My word, how white you are. Had a hard time, like the rest of them. I lay in bed at the end of the officers' ward, with only one other bed between me and the wall. That was occupied by the Gunner-General of the New Zealand Division. Opposite was another row of beds in which officers lay sleeping, or reading, or lying still with wistful eyes. That's all right, you're going to die, said a rosy-cheeked young orderly, after taking my temperature and feeling my pulse. It was his way of cheering a patient up. He told me how he had been torpedoed in the Dardanelles while he was ill with dysentery. He indulged in reminiscences with the New Zealand general, who had a grim gift of silence, but glinting eyes. In the bed on my left was a handsome boy with a fine, delicate face, a subaltern in the Coldstream Guards, with a pile of books at his elbow, all by Anatole France. It was the first time I had ever laid in hospital, and I felt amazingly weak and helpless, but interested in my surroundings. The day nurse, a tall, buxom New Zealand girl, whom the general chaffed with sarcastic humour, and who gave back more than she got, went off duty with a cheery good night all. And the night nurse took her place and made a first visit to each bed. She was a dainty little woman with the complexion of a delicate rose and large, luminous eyes. She had a nun-like look, utterly pure, but with a spiritual fire in those shining eyes of hers, for all these men, who were like children in her hands. They seemed glad at her coming. "Good evening, sister," said one man after another, even one who had laid with his eyes closed for an hour or more, with a look of death on his face. She knelt down beside each one, saying, "How are you tonight?" and chatting in a low voice, inaudible to the bed beyond. From one bed I heard a boy's voice say, "Oh, don't go yet, sister. You have only given me 2 minutes, and I want 10 at least. I am passionately in love with you, you know, and I have been waiting all day for your beauty." There was a gust of laughter in the ward. "The child is at it again," said one of the officers. "When are you going to write me another sonnet?" asked the nurse. "The last one was much admired." "The last one was rotten," said the boy. "I have written a real corker this time. Read it to yourself, and don't drop its pearls before these swine." "Well, you must be good, or I won't read it at all." An officer of the British Army, who was also a poet, hurled the bedclothes off and sat on the edge of his bed in his pajamas. "I'm fed up with everything. I hate war. I don't want to be a hero. I don't want to die. I want to be loved. I'm a glutton for love." In his pajamas the boy looked a child, no older than a schoolboy who was mine, and who still liked to be tucked up in bed by his mother. With his tousled hair and his petulant grimace, this lieutenant might have been Peter Pan from Kensington. The night nurse pretended to chide him. It was a very gentle chiding, but as abruptly as he had thrown off his clothes, he snuggled under them again and said, "All right, I'll be good. Only I want a kiss before I go to sleep." I became good friends with that boy, who was a promising young poet, and a joyous creature no more fit for war than a child of 10, hating the muck and horror of it, not ashamed to confess his fear, with a boyish wistfulness of hope that he might not be killed, because he loved life. But he was killed. I had a letter from his stricken mother months afterward. The child was missing then, and her heart cried out for him. Opposite my bed was a middle-aged man from Lancashire. I suppose he had been in a cotton mill or a factory, a hard-headed, simple-hearted fellow, as good as gold and always speaking of the wife. But his nerves had gone to pieces, and he was afraid to sleep because of the dreams that came to him. "Sister," he said, "don't let me go to sleep. Wake me up if you see me dozing. I see terrible things in my dreams." Frightful things. I can't bear it. You will sleep better tonight, she said. I am putting something in your milk, something to stop the dreaming. But he dreamed. I lay awake, feverish and restless, and heard the man opposite muttering and moaning in his sleep. Sometimes he would give a long, quivering sigh, and sometimes start violently, and then wake up in a dazed way, saying, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" trembling with fear, so that the bed was shaken. The night nurse was always by his side, in a moment when he called out, hushing him down, whispering to him. "I see pools of blood and bits of dead bodies in my sleep," he told me. "It's what I saw up at Basington. There was a fellow with his face blown off, walking about. I see him every night. Queer, isn't it? Nerves, you know. I didn't think I had a nerve in my body before this war." The little night nurse came to my bedside. "Can't you sleep?" "I'm afraid not. My heart is thumping in a queer way. May I smoke?" She put a cigarette between my lips and lighted a match. "Take a few whiffs and then try to sleep. You need lots of sleep." In the ward there was only the glimmer of night lights in red glasses, and now and then all through the night matches were lighted, illuminating the room for a second, followed by the glowing end of a cigarette shining like a star in the darkness. The sleeping men breathed heavily, tossed about violently, gave strange jerks and starts. Sometimes they spoke aloud in their sleep. "That isn't a dud, you fool. It will blow us to hell. Now then, get on with it, can't you? Look out. They're coming. Can't you see them moving by the wire?" The spirit of war was in that ward and hunted them even in their sleep. Lurking terrors surged up again in their subconsciousness. Sights which they had tried to forget stared at them through their closed eyelids. The daylight came and the night nurse slipped away, and the day nurse shook one's shoulders and said, "Time to wash and shave. No malingering." It was the discipline of the hospital. Men as weak as rats had to sit up in bed or crawl out of it and shave themselves. "You're merciless," I said, laughing painfully when the day nurse dabbed my back with cold iodine at 6 o'clock on a winter morning, with the windows wide open. "Oh, there's no mercy in this place," said the strong-minded girl. "It's kill or cure here, and no time to worry." "You're all devils," said the New Zealand general. "You don't care a damn about the patient so long as you have all the beds tidy by the time the doctor comes around. I'm a general, I am, and you can't order me about. And if you think I'm going to shave at this time in the morning, you are jolly well mistaken. I am down with dysentery, and don't you forget it. I didn't get through the Dardanelles to be murdered at Amiens." "That's where you may be mistaken, General," said the imperturbable girl. "I have to carry out orders, and if they lead to your death, it's not my responsibility. I'm paid a poor wage for this job, but I do my duty, rough or smooth, kill or cure. You're a vampire. That's what you are. I'm a nurse. If ever I hear you're going to marry a New Zealand boy, I'll warn him against you. He'll be too much of a fool to listen to you. I've a good mind to marry you myself and beat you every morning. Modern wives have strong muscles. Look at my arm." 3 nights in 1 week there were air raids, and as the German mark was the railway station, we were in the center of the danger zone. There was a frightful noise of splintering glass and smashing timber between each crash of high explosives. The whine of shrapnel from the anti-aircraft guns had a sinister note, abominable in the ears of those officers who had come down from the fighting lines nerve-racked and fever-stricken. They lay very quiet. The night nurse moved about from bed to bed with her flash lamp. Her face was pale, but she showed no other sign of fear and was braver than her patients at that time, though they had done the hero's job all right. It was in another hospital a year later, when I lay sick again, that an officer, a very gallant gentleman, said, "If there is another air raid, I shall go mad." He had been stationed near the blast furnace of Les Eiselquins, near Bethune, and had been in many air raids, when over 63 shells had blown his hut to bits and killed his men, until he could bear it no more. In the Amiens hospital, some of the patients had their heads under the bedclothes like little children. Part 5, Chapter 16. The life of Amiens ended for a while, and the city was deserted by all its people after the night of March 30th, 1918, which will be remembered forever to the age-long history of Amiens as its night of greatest tragedy. But for a week the enemy had been advancing across the old battlefields after the first onslaught in the morning of March 21st, when our lines were stormed and broken by his men's odds against our defending troops. We war correspondents had suffered mental agonies like all who knew what had happened better than the troops themselves. Every day after the first breakthrough we pushed out in different directions. Hamilton, Fife and I went together sometimes until we came up with the backwash of the Great Retreat, ebbing back and back, day after day, with increasing speed, until it drew very close to Amiens. It was a kind of ordered chaos, terrible to see. It was a chaos like that of upturned ant heaps, but with each ant trying to rescue its eggs and sticks in a persistent, orderly way, directed by some controlling or communal intelligence, only instead of eggs and sticks these soldier ants of ours. In the whole world behind our front lines, we're trying to rescue heavy guns, motor lorries, tanks, ambulances, hospital stores, ordnance stores, steam rollers, agricultural implements, transport wagons, railway engines, YMCA tents, gun horse and mule columns, while rear guard actions were being fought within gunfire of them, and walking wounded were hobbling back along the roads in this uproar of traffic, and word came that a further retreat was happening and that the enemy had broken through again. Amiens seemed threatened on the morning when, to the north, Albert was held by a mixed crowd of Scottish and English troops, too thin, as I could see when I passed through them, to fight any big action, with an enemy advancing rapidly from Courcelette and outflanking our line by Montauban and Fricourt. I saw our men marching hastily in retreat to escape that tightening net, and while the southern side of Amiens was held by a crowd of stragglers with cyclist battalions, clerks from headquarters staffs, and dismounted cavalry, commanded by Brigadier General Carey, sent down hurriedly to link them together and stop a widening gap until the French could get to our relief on the right, and until the Australians had come down from Flanders. There was nothing on that day to prevent the Germans breaking through to Amiens, except the courage of exhausted boys thinly strung out, and the lagging footsteps of the Germans themselves, who had suffered heavy losses all the way and were spent for a while by their progress over the wild ground of the old fighting fields. Their heavy guns were far behind, unable to keep pace with the storm troops, and the enemy was relying entirely on machine guns and a few field guns, but most of our guns were also out of action, captured or falling back to new lines, and upon the speed with which the enemy could mass his men for a new assault depended the safety of Amiens and the road to Abbeville and the coast. If he could hurl fresh divisions of men against our line on that last night of March, or bring up strong forces of cavalry or armoured cars, our line would break and Amiens would be lost, and all our work would be in jeopardy. That was certain. It was visible. It could not be concealed by any camouflage of hope or courage. It was after a day on the Somme battlefields, passing through our retiring troops, that I sat down, with other war correspondents and several officers, to a dinner in the old Hotel du Rhin in Amiens. It was a dismal meal in a room where there had been much laughter, and, throughout the battles of the Somme, in 1916, a coming and going of generals and staffs and officers of all grades, cheery and high-spirited at these little tables where there were good wine and not bad food, and putting away from their minds for the time being the thought of tragic losses or forlorn battles in which they might fall. In the quietude of the hotel garden, a little square plot of grass bordered by flower beds, I had had strange conversations with boys who had revealed their souls a little, after dinner in the darkness, their faces bared now and then by the light of cigarettes or the flare of a match. "Death is nothing," said one young officer just down from the Somme fields for a week's rest cure for jangled nerves. "I don't care a damn for death, but it's the waiting for it, the devilishness of its uncertainty, the sight of one's pulse blown to bits about one, and the animal fear under shell fire, that break one's pluck. My nerves are like fiddle strings." In that garden, other men, with a queer laugh now and then between their stories, had told me their experiences in shell craters and ditches under frightful fire which had wiped out their platoons or companies. A bedraggled stork, the inseparable companion of a waddling gull, used to listen to the conferences with one leg tucked under his wing and its head on one side, with one watchful, beady eye fixed on the figures in khaki, until suddenly it would clap its long bill, rapidly in a wonderful imitation of machine gun fire. "Curse the bloody bird," said officers startled by this evil and reminiscent noise, and caper with ridiculous postures round the imperturbable gull. Beyond the lines, from the dining room, would come the babble of many tongues and the laughter of officers telling stories against one another. over their bottles of wine, served by Gaston the head waiter. Between our discussions on strategy, he was a strategist by virtue of service in the trenches and several wounds, or by von Tirpitz, an older, whiskered man, or by Joseph, who had a high, cackling laugh and strong views against the fair sex, and the inevitable cry, "C.S. Laguerre," when officers complained of the service. There had been merry parties in this room, crowded with the ghosts of many heroic fellows, but it was a gloomy gathering on that evening at the end of March, when we sat there for the last time. There were there officers who had lost their towns, and Dardos's, Deputy Assistant Director of Ordnance Supplies, whose stores had gone up in smoke and flame, and a few cavalry officers, back from special leave and appalled by what had happened in their absence, and a group of YMC officials who had escaped by the skin of their teeth from huts now far behind the German lines, and censors who knew that no blue pencil could hide the truth of the retreat, and war correspondents who had to write the truth and hated it. Gaston whispered gloomily behind my chair. Mon petit caporal, he called me that because of a fancied likeness to the young Napoleon Dietzsdonck. Vous croyez quils vont passer par Amiens? Non, ce n'est pas possible car, pour la 12e fois? Non, je refuse les croire, mais si est mauvais si est de fruits, après tant de sacrifice. Madame, of the cash desk, sat in the dining room, for company's sake, fixing up accounts as though the last day of reckoning had come, as it had. Her hair, with its little curls, was still in perfect order. She had 2 dabs of colour on her cheeks, as usual, but underneath a waxen pallor. She was working out accounts with a young officer, who smoked innumerable cigarettes to steady his nerves. Von Tirpitz was going round in an absent-minded way, pulling at his long whiskers. The war correspondents talked together. We spoke gloomily, in low voices, so that the waiters should not hear. If they break through to Abbeville, we shall lose the coast. Will that be a win for the Germans even then? It will make it hell in the Channel. We shall transfer our base to St. Nazaire. France won't give in now, whatever happens. And England never gives in. We're exhausted all the same. It's a question of manpower. They're bound to take Albert tonight or tomorrow. I don't see that at all. There's still a line. A line. A handful of tired men. It will be the devil if they get into Villers-Bretonneux tonight. It commands Amiens. They could blow the place off the map. They won't. We keep on saying they won't. We said they won't get the Somme crossings, but they did. Let's face it squarely, without any damned false optimism. That has been our curse all through. Better than your damned pessimism. It's quite possible that they will be in this city tonight. What is to keep them back? There's nothing up the road. It would look silly if we were all captured tonight. How they would laugh. We shouldn't laugh, though. I think we ought to keep an eye on things. How are we to know? We are utterly without means of communication. Anything may happen in the night. Something happened then. It was 7:30 in the evening. There were 2 enormous crashes outside the windows of the Hotel du Rhin. All the windows shook, and the whole house seemed to rock. There was a noise of rending wood, many falls of bricks, and a cascade of falling glass. Instinctively and instantly a number of officers threw themselves on the floor to escape, flying bits of steel and glass splinters blown sideways. Then someone laughed. Not this time. At this time. The officers rose from the floor and took their places at the table and lit cigarettes again. But they were listening. We listened to the loud hum of airplanes, the well-known zoos of the Gotha's double fuselage. More bombs were dropped farther into the town, with the same sound of explosives and falling masonry. The anti-aircraft guns got to work, and there was the shrill chorus of shrapnel shells winging over the roofs. Bang! Crash! That was near again. Some of the officers strolled out of the dining room. They're making a mess outside. Perhaps we'd better get away before it gets too hot. Madame from the cash desk turned to her accounts again. I noticed the increasing pallor of her skin beneath the 2 dabs of red. But she controlled her nerves pluckily, even smiled, too, at the young officer who was settling up for a group of others. The moon had risen over the houses of Amiens. It was astoundingly bright and beautiful in a clear sky and still air, and the streets were flooded with white light, and the roofs glittered like silver above intense black shadows under the gables where the rays were barred by projecting walls. "Curse the moon," said one officer. "How I hate its damned light." But the moon, cold and smiling, looked down upon the world at war and into this old city of Amiens in which bombs were bursting. Women were running close to the walls. Groups of soldiers made a dash from one doorway to another. Horses galloped with heavy wagons up the street of the Three Pebbles, while shrapnel flickered in the sky above them and paving stones were hurled up in bursts of red fire and explosions. Many horses were killed by flying chunks of steel. They lay bleeding monstrously so that there were large pools of blood around them. An officer came into the side door of the Hotel du Rhin. He was white under his steel hat, which he pushed back while he wiped his forehead. "A fellow was killed just by my side," he said. "We were standing in a doorway together and something caught him in the face. He fell like a log, without a sound, as dead as a doornail." There was a flight of midges in the sky, droning with that double note which vibrated like cello strings, very loudly, and with that sinister noise I could see them quite clearly now and then, as they passed across the face of the moon, black, flitting things, with a glitter of shrapnel below them. From time to time they went away until they were specks of silver and black, but always they came back again, or others came, with new stores of bombs which they unloaded over Amiens. So it went on all through the night. I went up to a bedroom and lay on a bed, trying to sleep. But it was impossible. My willpower was not strong enough to disregard those crashes in the streets outside, when houses collapsed with frightful falling noises after bomb explosions. My inner vision foresaw the ceiling above me pierced by one of those bombs, and the room in which I lay engulfed in the chaos of this wing of the Hotel du Rhin. Many times I said, "To hell with it all, I'm going to sleep," and then sat up in the darkness at the renewal of that tumult and switched on the electric light. No, impossible to sleep. Outside in the corridor there was a stampede of heavy boots. Officers were running to get into the cellars before the next crash, which might fling them into the dismal gulfs. The thought of that cellar pulled me down like the law of gravity. I walked along the corridor, now deserted, and saw a stairway littered with broken glass, which my feet scrunched. There were no lights in the basement of the hotel, but I had a flash lamp, going dim, and by its pale I fumbled my way to a stone passage leading to the cellar. That flight of stone steps was littered also with broken glass. In the cellar itself was a mixed company of men who had been dining earlier in the evening, joined by others who had come in from the streets for shelter. Some of them had dragged down mattresses from the bedrooms and were lying there in their trench coats, with their steel hats beside them. Others were sitting on wooden cases wearing their steel hats, while there were others on their knees and their faces in their hands, trying to sleep. There were some of the town majors who had lost their towns, and some Canadian cavalry officers, and 2 or 3 private soldiers, and some motor drivers and orderlies, and 2 young cooks of the hotel lying together on dirty straw. By one of the stone pillars of the vaulted room 2 American war correspondents, Sims and Mackenzie, were sitting on a packing case playing cards on a board between them. They had stuck candles in empty wine bottles, and the flickering light played on their faces and cast deep shadows under their eyes. I stood watching these men in that cellar and thought what a good subject it would be for the pencil of Muirhead Bone. I wanted to get a comfortable place. There was only one place on the bare stones, and when I lay down there my bones ached abominably, and it was very cold. Through an aperture in the window came a keen draught, and I could see in a square of moonlit sky a glinting star. It was not much of a cellar. A direct hit on the Hotel du Rhin would make a nasty mess in this vaulted room and end a game of cards. After 15 minutes I became restless, and decided that the room upstairs, after all, was infinitely preferable to this damp cellar and these hard stones. I returned to it and lay down on the bed again and switched off the light. But the noises outside, the loneliness of the room, the sense of sudden death fluking overhead, made me sit up again and listen intently. The Gothas were droning over Amiens again. Many houses round about were being torn and shattered. What a wreckage was being made of the dear old city. I paced up and down the room, smoking cigarettes, one after another, until a mighty explosion, very close, made all my nerves quiver. No, decidedly that cellar was the best place. If one had to die, it was better to be in the company of friends. Down I went again, meeting an officer whom I knew well. He, too, was a wanderer between the cellar and the abandoned bedrooms. "I am getting bored with this," he said. "It's absurd to think that this filthy cellar is any safer than upstairs. But the dugout sense calls one down. Anyhow, I can't sleep." We stood looking into the cellar. There was something comical as well as sinister in the sight of the company there, sprawled on the mattresses, vainly trying to extract comfort out of packing cases for pillows or gas bags on steel hats. One friend of ours, a cavalry officer of the old school, looked across between Charlie Chaplin and Old Bill with a fierce frown above his black moustache. Sims and Mackenzie still played their game of cards, silently, between the guttering candles. I think I went from the cellar to the bedroom, and from the bedroom to the cellar 6 times that night. There was never 10 minutes relief from the drone of Gothas, who were making a complete job of Amiens. It was at 4 in the morning that I met the same officer who saw me wandering before. "Let us go for a walk," he said. "The birds will be away by dawn." It was nothing like dawn when we went out of the side door of the Hotel du Rhin and strolled into the street of the Three Pebbles. There was still the same white moonlight, intense and glittering, but with a paler sky. It shone down upon dark pools of blood and the carcasses of horses and fragments of flesh, from which a sickly smell rose. The roadway was littered with bits of timber and heaps of masonry. Many houses had collapsed into wild chaos, and others, though still standing, had been stripped of their wooden frontages, and their walls were scarred by bomb splinters. Every part of the old city, as we explored it later, had been badly mauled, and hundreds of houses were utterly destroyed. The air raid ceased at 4:30 a.m., when the first light of dawn came into the sky. That day Amiens was evacuated by command of the French military authorities, and the inhabitants trailed out of the city, leaving everything behind them. I saw the women locking up their shops where there were any doors to shut or their shops still standing. Many people must have been killed and buried in the night beneath their own houses. I never knew how many. The fugitives escaped the next phase of the tragedy in Amiens when, within a few hours, the enemy sent over the first high velocities and for many weeks afterward scattered them about the city, destroying many other houses. A fire started by these shells formed a great gap between the Rue des Jacobins and the Rue des Trousquets-Laux, where there had been an arcade and many good shops and houses. I saw the fires smouldering about charred beams and twisted ironwork when I went through the city after the day of Exodus. Part 5, Chapter 17. It was a pitiful adventure to go through Amiens in the days of its desolation, and we who had known its people so well hated its loneliness. All abandoned towns have a tragic aspect. I often think of Douai, which was left with all its people under compulsion of the enemy, but Amiens was strangely sinister with heaps of ruins in its narrow streets, and the abominable noise of high-velocity shells in flight above its roofs, and crashing now in one direction, and now in another. One of our sentries came out of a little house near the place and said, "Keep as much as possible to the west side of the town, sir. They've been falling pretty thick on the east side. Made no end of a mess." On the way back from Villers-Bretonneux and the Australian headquarters on the left bank of the Somme, we ate sandwiches in the public gardens outside the Hotel du Rhin. There were big shell holes in the flower beds, and trees had been torn down and flung across the pathway, and there was a broken statue lying on the grass. Some French and English soldiers tramped past. Then there was no living soul about in the place which had been so crowded with life, with pretty women and children, and young officers doing their shopping, and the business of a city at work. "It makes one understand what Rome was like after the barbarians had sacked and left it," said a friend of mine. "There is something ghastly about it," said another. We stood round the Hotel du Rhin, shut up and abandoned. The house next door had been wrecked, and it was scarred and wounded, but still stood after that night of terror. One day during its desolation I went to a banquet in Amiens in the cellars of the Hotel de Ville. It was to celebrate the 4th of July, and an invitation had been sent to me by the French Commandant de Place and the English A.P.M. It was a beau geste, gallant and romantic in those days of trouble, when Amiens was still closely beleaguered, but safer now that Australians and British troops were holding the line strongly outside, with French on their right southward from Boves and Hengist Wood. The French commandant had procured a collection of flags, and his men had decorated the battered city with the tricolour. It even fluttered above some of the ruins, as though for the passing of a pageant. But only a few cars entered the city and drew up to the town hall, and then took cover behind the walls. Down below, in the cellars, the damp walls were garlanded with flowers from the market gardens of the Somme, now deserted by their gardeners, and roses were heaped on the banqueting table. General Monash, commanding the Australian Corps, was there, with the general of the French division on his right. A young American officer sat very grave and silent, not perhaps understanding much of the conversation about him, because most of the guests were French officers, with senators and deputies of Amiens and its department. There was good wine to drink from the cold vaults of the Hotel de Ville, and with the scent of rose and hope for victory, in spite of all disasters the German offensive had been checked, and the Americans were now coming over in a tide. It was a cheerful luncheon party. The old general, black-visaged, bullet-headed, with a bristly mustache like a French bull terrier, sat utterly silent, eating steadily and fiercely. But the French commandant de place, as handsome as Athos, as gay as D'Artagnan, raised his glass to England and France, to the gallant allies, and to all fair women. He became reminiscent of his days as a sous lieutenant. He remembered a girl called Marguerite, she was exquisite, and another called Yvonne, he had adored her. O life, O youth, he had been a careless young devil, with laughter in his heart. Part 5. Chapter 18. I suppose it was 3 months later when I saw the first crowds coming back to their homes in Amiens. The tide had turned and the enemy was in hard retreat. Amiens was safe again. They had never had any doubt of this homecoming after that day nearly 3 months before, when, in spite of the enemies being so close, Foch said, in his calm way, I guarantee Amiens. They believed what Marshal Foch said. He always knew. So now they were coming back again with their little bundles and their babies and small children holding their hands or skirts, according as they had received permits from the French authorities. They were the lucky ones whose houses still existed. They were conscious of their own good fortune and came chattering very cheerfully from the station up the street of the Three Pebbles, on their way to their streets. But every now and then they gave a cry of surprise and dismay at the damage done to other people's houses. Oh la la, regardez ça, siesta fruits. There was the butcher's shop, destroyed, and the house of poor little Madeleine, and old Christopher's workshop, and the milliner's place, where they used to buy their Sunday hats, and that frightful gap where the arcade had been. Truly, poor Amiens had suffered martyrdom, though, thank God, the cathedral still stood in glory, hardly touched, with only one little shell-hole through the roof. Terrible was the damage up the Rue de Beauvais and the streets that went out of it. To one rubbish heap which had been a corner house 2 girls came back. Perhaps the French authorities had not had that one on their list. The girls came tripping home, with light in their eyes, staring about them, ejaculating pity for neighbors whose houses had been destroyed. Then suddenly they stood outside their own house and saw that the direct hit of a shell had knocked it to bits. The light went out of their eyes. They stood there staring, with their mouths open. Some Australian soldiers stood about and watched the girls, understanding the drama. Bit of a mess, missy, said one of them. Not much left of the old home, eh? The girls were amazingly brave. They did not weep. They climbed up a hillock of bricks and pulled out bits of old, familiar things. They recovered the whole of a child's perambulator, with its wheels crushed. With an air of triumph and shrill laughter they turned round to the Australians. Pour les bébés, they cried. While there's life, there's hope, said one of the Australians with sardonic humour. So, the martyrdom of Amiens was at an end, and life came back to the city that had been dead, and the soul of the city had survived. I have not seen it since then, but one day I hope I shall go back and shake hands with Gaston the waiter and say, Comment ça va, mon vieux? How goes it, my old one? And stroll into the bookshop and say, Bonjour, mademoiselle, and walk round the cathedral and see its beauty in moonlight again, when no one will look up and say, Curse the moon. There will be many ghosts in the city at night, the ghosts of British officers and men who thronged those streets in the Great War and have now passed on.
This concludes the 12th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.